This is the cheapest lens to get started in sports photography. It's the Sony 55-210mm lens, and I'm going to show you why I think it's the best lens to get started in sports photography. Stay tuned to the end for some test shots. This is the Sony 55-210mm lens. It's an ASPZ zoom lens, and it has an aperture from 4.5 to 5.6, and the barrier extends. It also has built-in steady shot for photo and video, and I personally believe it's the best lens to get started in sports photography. Let me elaborate. This is a very cheap lens. I believe brand new it costs almost $350, and on the used market you can get it for about $150, maybe around $200. And it's also very lightweight, and given that most beginner photographers start with an ASPC lens, I believe it's a great deal for what it gives you. Let me give you some background as to why I chose this lens. When I was first getting into sports photography, I wanted to really see if I was really going to enjoy it, and I wanted to do so pretty quickly without making a huge investment. So I already had an ASPC lens, being my Sony a6400, and I wanted to get a lens that would give me that zoom look without having to break the bank. So after looking for a couple weeks, I discovered the Sony 55-210mm lens. Although it is a kit lens, I believe it gives you a lot for what you would need for sports photography. The most important thing to remember when shooting with this lens is shooting in the middle of the day. So I knew when I got this lens, I was going to be shooting sports like soccer and football, so I was going to be shooting in the middle of the day with a ton of sunlight. I feel like that is where this lens shines the most, because since it doesn't go down to a low f-stop like the 2.8 of many other zoom lenses, it would do just fine. In the middle of the day, we're usually going to use a higher f-stop anyway, so the fact that this only goes down to 4.5 wasn't such a big deal. Another big win for this cheap lens is that it has steady shot, which is great as most beginners cameras don't really have in-body image stabilization, just as my Sony a6400 doesn't, so that's a big added plus when wanting to do pictures or video. So this is a great lens to get started with, especially if you have a camera that doesn't have IBIS. For the price. As I said, you really can't beat a zoom lens for this quality for $140. Really briefly, I'm just going to read off some of the specs of this camera just so you can see them. I will also post links to the Sony manufacturer website with all the specifications, but the important ones to note for this camera is that it is a zoom lens, so the barrel does extend. The f-stop is anywhere from 4.5 to 5.6, which once again, I said it's not a big deal if you're shooting in daylight. It is super light, coming in at 345 grams, and it does have, as I said, steady shot, which pairs great with those cheaper cameras as most beginners have. For sports photography specifically, I was pretty impressed with this lens. As I did mention, the f-stop only goes down to 4.5, but I did not feel like that limited me at all. The biggest surprise I had when using this lens was the range. 55-210mm is a really large range, and I believe it was very helpful, especially when I was shooting my first soccer tournament. As you know, soccer, we play on a very large field, and having that 210mm really did come in handy when the players are going anywhere past half field. Of course, when you're starting sports photography, you can move up and down the field as much as you want, but generally you want to stay put, especially for photography, in one side of the field just to try to get those impactful plays like a free kick, like a penalty kick, or like any shots toward the goal. And I feel like this lens, for that purpose, really did function. Another good thing to consider with this lens is it is a Sony lens, and I do have a Sony body, so since it is a native lens to Sony, the autofocus on this was amazing. I never had a moment where my pictures were out of focus, just because, as I said, a Sony lens to a Sony body really gives you that optimal Sony autofocus, which is really great. The steady shot also came in very handy, as you know, when you're taking any pictures in sports, you're always moving around, things are always happening, sometimes players get close to you, so being able to have that, I would say, the comfortability to move around and not worry whether my shot's going to be out of focus was very helpful, especially as a beginner shooting my first soccer game ever. When it comes to sharpness for this lens, I do believe it does more than enough, especially when you're shooting in the middle of the day with a lot of sunlight. Although this lens only goes down to 4.5 aperture, I do believe it's more than enough, especially when you're getting started, just to see if you're really going to develop that passion for sports photography. But I feel like the images I took with this could even be passable when you're selling to like a recreational league or one of those like smaller kids leagues in elementary school or middle school. I do feel like this would be more than enough, and especially if you know how to work your camera, work with your sharpness, work with your ISO, work with your shutter speed, I do feel that this can serve its purpose for what it's used. When it comes to videography with this lens, I feel like it does show its weaknesses in comparison to other lenses, but it definitely still is able to hold up, especially for a beginner. I believe as a beginner photographer, this lens will take you a lot farther than it will for videography. For videography, you will see its limitations fairly quickly, especially if it's not a sunny day out. Once again, I was testing this lens, as I said, in the middle of the day around 2 to 3 p.m. and I was able to take some shots with this, but I just didn't really love the quality came out of the camera, given that this lens isn't that sharp and the aperture can only go down to 4.5. Although I did love the range it gave me, the sharpness was not the best and it was significantly noticeable, especially when it comes to videography. Given that, I would still like to compliment this lens. It did do a great job in a few things for videography. One of the things I can compliment it on is the autofocus and the steady shot. So I never found this lens to lose focus or be out of focus when I was taking shots, and I also did not hunt for focus, which is very surprising for me given the price point of this lens. Another thing to consider was that it does have steady shot, so when I was filming videos for the soccer team, I never found that my shots were as wobbly in comparison to other lenses. I felt like everything had like a great stabilization for the price, and I do think that is a big strength, especially for a starter lens. So that is important to consider when shooting with this. Overall, I feel like the Sony 55-210mm lens is a great starter lens for anyone looking to get into sports photography or sports videography. As I said, this lens really did surprise me when it came to sports photography. And however you guys feel about this lens, I would love to hear your opinion down below in the comments. So if you have anything, just let me know down below and I would love to chat about it with you guys. But that's all, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.